Rene Guenon's analysis of the black cube of Saturn. The narrator finds this chapter from The Reign of Quantity and Times and Times by Rene Guenon, From Sphere to Cube, very interesting. It seems that Rene Guenon kind of predicted the black cube conspiracy. If you're familiar with that one, there's this Kabbalistic Saturnian cube which pops up a lot in corporate logos and statues, etc. Rene Guenon seems to have known about this cube and its malicious implications nearly 100 years before it started appearing everywhere, so this might be of interest for the conspiracy types. Anyways, without further ado. Chapter 20. Now that a few illustrations have been given of what has been called the solidification of the world, there remains the question of its representation in geometrical symbolism, wherein it can be figured as a gradual transition from sphere to cube. Indeed, to begin with, the sphere is intrinsically the primordial form because it is the least specified of all, similar to itself in every direction in such a way that in any rotatory movement around its centre, all its successive positions are strictly superimposable on one another. The sphere, then, can be said to be the most universal form of all, containing in a certain sense all other forms, which will emerge from it by means of differentiations taking place in certain particular directions. And that is why the spherical form is, in all traditions, that of the egg of the world. In other words, the form of that which represents the global integrality in the first and embryonic state of all the possibilities that will be developed from the course of a cycle of manifestation. It is well to note, in addition, that this first state, so far as our world is concerned, belongs properly to the domain of subtle manifestation, as much as the latter necessarily precedes gross manifestation and its immediate principle. This is why the form of the perfect sphere, or that of the circle corresponding to it in plane geometry as a section of the sphere by a given directional plane, is in fact never realised in the corporeal world. On the other hand, the cube is opposed to the sphere as being the most arrested form of all. It can be so expressed, this means that it corresponds to a maximum of specification. The cube is also the form that is related to the earth as one of its elements, inasmuch as the earth is the terminating and final element of manifestation in the corporeal state, and consequently it corresponds also to the end of the cycle of manifestation, or to what has been called the stopping point of cyclical movement. The form is thus, in a sense, above all that of the solid, and it symbolises stability insofar as this implies the stoppage of all movement, and it is evident that the equilibrium of the cube resting on one of its faces is in fact more stable than that of any other body. It is important to note that this stability, coming from the end of the descending movement, is not and cannot be anything but an unqualified immobility, of which the nearest representation in the corporal world is afforded by the minerals, and this immobility, if it could be entirely realised, would really be the inverted reflection at the lowest point of the principle of immutability of the highest point. Immobility or stability, thus understood as represented by the cube, is therefore related to the substantial pole of manifestation, just as immutability, in which all possibilities are comprehended in the global state, represented by the sphere, is related to the essential pole. And this is why the cube also symbolises the idea of base or foundation, which again corresponds to the substantial pole. Attention must also be drawn to the fact that the faces of a cube can be considered as being oriented in opposite pairs corresponding to the three dimensions of space. In other words, as parallel to the three planes determined by the axis forming the system of coordinates to which that space is related, and which allows its being measured, that is, of being effectively realised in its integrality. It has been explained elsewhere that the three axes forming the three-dimensional cross must be looked upon as being traced through the centre of a sphere that fills the whole of space by its indefinite expansion. The three planes determined by these axes are also necessarily passing through the same centre, which is the origin of the whole system of coordinates. And this establishes the relation that exists between the two extreme forms, sphere and cube, a relation in which what was interior and central in the sphere is, so to speak, turned inside out. to become the surface of the exteriority of the cube. The cube also represents the earth in all the traditional meanings of that word. That is, not only the earth as a corporal element in the sense in which it is mentioned above, but also as a principle of a much more universal order. The principle designated to the Far Eastern tradition as earth, T, in correlation with the heaven, Tn, spherical or circular forms are related to heaven, cubic or square forms the earth, since these two complementary terms are the equivalent of Purusha and Prakriti in the Hindu doctrine, which means that they are simply another expression for the essence and substance taken in their universal meaning. Exactly the same conclusion as before is arrived in this instance. It is also evident that, like the conceptions of essence and substance, the same symbolism is always susceptible of application at different levels, that is to say, either to the principles of a particular state of existence, or to the integrality of universal manifestation. Not only are these two geometrical forms related to heaven and earth, but so also are the instruments used to draw them, namely the compass and the square. And this is so in the symbolism of Far Eastern tradition as well as that of Western initiatic traditions. And the different correspondences of these two forms give rise in different circumstances to multiple symbolical and ritual applications. Another case in which the relation of these same geometrical forms is in evidence is that of the symbol of the terrestrial paradise and that of the heavenly Jerusalem, to which reference has already been made elsewhere, as this case is especially important from the point of view adopted in this book, since the symbolism in question is in fact considered of the two extremities of the present cycle. Now, the form of the terrestrial paradise corresponding to the beginning of the cycle is circular, whereas that of the heavenly Jerusalem corresponding to its end is the square. And the circular boundary of the terrestrial paradise is none other than the horizontal section of the egg of the world, that is, of the universal and primordial spherical form. It could be said that the circle itself finally changed into a square, since the two extremities must join, or rather, the cycle never really being closed, for that would imply impossible repetition, they must correspond exactly. The presence of the same tree of life in the centre in each case shows clearly it is only actually a question of two states of one and the same thing. The square here representing the accomplishment of the possibilities of the cycle, which were in germinal condition in the circular organic girdle of the beginning, and are subsequently fixed and stabilized in a state of definition, so to speak, at least in relation to the particular cycle concerned. The final result can be represented as a crystallization, again showing affinity with the cubic form, or the square in the plane section. It becomes a city with a mineral symbolism, whereas at the beginning there was a garden with a vegetable symbolism, vegetation representing the elaboration of the germs in the sphere of the vital assimilation. Reference was made above to the immobility of minerals as being an image of the final state towards which the solidification of the world is tending. But it is well to add that in considering the heavenly Jerusalem, the mineral has been regarded as already being in a transformed or sublimated state, for it figures as precious stones in the description of that city, and this is why the fixation is only final with respect to the present cycle, and being the stopping point, the same heavenly Jerusalem must, by virtue of the causal linkage that admits of no actual discontinuity, become the terrestrial paradise of the future cycle. The end of the one and the beginning of the other being actually one and the same moment viewed from two opposite sides. It is nonetheless true that, if consideration is confined to the present cycle, a moment finally arrives at which the wheel stops turning, and here, as always, the symbolism is perfectly coherent, for a wheel is circular in shape, and if we were to get out of shape in such a way as to end by being a square, it is obvious that it could not do otherwise than stop. This is why the moment in question appears as an end of time, and it is then, according to the Hindu tradition, that the 12 suns will shine simultaneously, for time is in fact measured by the passage of the sun through the 12 signs of the zodiac, making the annual cycle, and when the rotation is stopped, the 12 corresponding aspects will, so to speak, be merged into one. thus returning into the essential and primordial unity of their common nature, since they do not differ except in their relation to universal manifestation, which will then be at an end. Moreover, the changing of the circle into an equivalent square is also what is known as the squaring of the circle. Those who declare that this is an insoluble problem, though they be wholly unaware of its symbolical significance, are thus right in fact, since the squaring understood in its true sense cannot be realized until the end of the cycle. A consequence of all this is that the solidification of the world appears to some extent to have a double meaning, considering in itself and from within the cycle as being consequence of a movement leading down towards quantity and materiality. It evidently has an unfavourable significance, even a sinister one, as opposed to spirituality. But, in another aspect, it is nonetheless necessary in order to prepare, though it be in a manner that could be called negative, the ultimate fixation of the results of the cycle in the form of the heavenly Jerusalem, where these results will at once become the germs of the possibilities of the future cycle. Nevertheless, it goes without saying that in the final fixation itself, and in order that it may indeed become a restoration of the primordial state, the immediate intervention of a transcendent principle is necessary, otherwise nothing could be saved and the cosmos would simply evaporate into chaos. It is this intervention that produces the final reversal, already prefigured in the transmutation of minerals in the heavenly Jerusalem, as bringing about the reappearance of the terrestrial paradise in the visible world, where there will be, after a new heaven and a new earth, since it will be the beginning of another Manvantara world cycle, and of the existence of another humanity.